Does it?
So thank you. I mean, it's a trenchant question, Senator.
I'm so pleased that you beat your cancer diagnosis.
You're very kind.
We all followed your unfortunately public dealing with that. And,
My bandana made it public, I think. Yes.
But it was a nice touch. It was a nice touch. And I'm sorry about your son.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I gather, Congressman, that you support trying to make the world carbon neutral by 2050?
Yes.
Okay. And I gather from your testimony that, in your judgment, part of achieving that goal is eliminating the use of fossil fuel generated energy?
Not immediately.
Right.
But there are staged reductions that would be required in order for us to meet that goal. And I don't think it requires the absolute elimination of all carbon fuels, but I think something like a steady 4% per year reduction.
By 2050, how much do we need to eliminate?
Well, what the scientists are telling us is that we in order to avert the most extreme calamities, we need to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
But here's what I'm getting at. Right now, America relies on fossil fuels for 80% of its energy. By 2050, what percentage do you think that should be in order for us to become carbon neutral?
I better not opine on that because I don't know, but I will tell you this, and I see where you're going. This is a tremendous challenge, maybe the greatest challenge of our lifetimes, and I think it...
I understand. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Just give me a little bit of time here.
Yeah.
Are you... Let me ask you this. How many people are there in the world? What's the world's population?
Is it now 4.5 billion?
It's about 8 billion.
Is it 8,
Yeah,
8 billion?
I'm not trying to trick you.
All right.
I had to look it up myself.
I should have updated on that.
It's 8 billion people living in the
8 billion,
world.
okay.
4 billion people depend on fertilizer made by natural gas to eat. If we didn't have natural gas, 4 billion people would starve to death. What do we do about that?
So that is,
fossil fuels.
I mean, that's precisely the challenge that we need to be confronting and that we should have been confronting all these decades. How do we disengage gradually from one model of energy consumption and move into another so that we are meeting the public health goals that are urgent, as the distinguished senator from New Mexico just...
Are you familiar with what's called a boreal forest?
No, only in those
Forests in the northernmost part of the world, just below the Arctic, in North America, in Eurasia. There millions of acres burn there naturally every year. The fires are less today than they were 150 years ago, but obviously forest fires produce carbon. And I was reading a study this weekend. I want to get my facts straight here. They said the carbon released by these naturally occurring forest fires in boreal forests, nobody lives there. Let's see. Wildfires in the boreal forests in North America and Eurasia in 1 year, 2021, released double the amount of all global CO2 produced in 2001. And 3 times as much as the Inflation Reduction Act is projected to reduce by 2030. My point is, the Inflation Reduction Act is going to end up costing about $1.2 trillion. Presumably, there are estimates about how much carbon it will reduce by 2030. American people are going to spend a lot of money, $1.2 trillion, For what? The carbon released by naturally occurring boreal forest fires in 2001 is 3 times the amount we'll save by asking the American people to spend $1.2 trillion of their money on the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, you know, unless you're the reason that your parents drink, that doesn't make sense, does it?
So, thank you. I mean, it's a trenchant question, Senator. I've heard these comparisons before between natural greenhouse gas emissions, which are obviously a product of forestry and agriculture and the agricultural revolution, and what we contribute through industrial greenhouse gas emissions. But I think it's a bit of a distraction from the real issue because we take for granted.
These are peer-reviewed studies, Congressman.
Oh no, but the peer-reviewed studies show
exist. I promise you.
Oh no, but I'm not doubting the science for 1 minute. I'm saying let's take the science for granted. Let's take nature for granted. Thank God that we have forests and we have greenhouse gas emissions that come from agriculture and so on. All of that is something that we take for granted. Okay, now we also, however, can reduce agricultural greenhouse gas emissions through looking at industrial livestock practices.
My point is, I'm going way over. This is my last question.
Yeah.
We spend all this money. Okay, it's going to cost America about $1 trillion a year to make us carbon neutral by 2050.
Yes.
We don't lower world temperatures a scintilla of a degree if you look at the boreal forest fires. So what do?
Oh, I got you. But would you dispute that it would be far worse if we do nothing? In other words, if we stay on the path that big oil would have us stay on, are you denying that we would be in a situation where the Earth's temperature goes up?
That's not your goal in trying to make us carbon neutral. Is to be. It's a zero-sum game. Your goal is not to make it better. Your point is, as I understand it, that the world will end if we don't achieve the carbon neutrality.
Right. We want to prevent calamity. We want to make our one planetary habitat as livable as possible, right?
Do we need to spend trillions of dollars fighting the boreal forest fires?
Well, let's go back to the Inflation Reduction Act, which you invoked before. Most of the money which you're describing as being spent on climate change measures was actually tax incentives for the stimulation of renewable energy.
Agreed, but they're not stopping the boreal forest fires. I mean, we spend all this money and we reduce carbon, and the boreal forest fires just spit out 3 times the amount of carbon.
All right, do you?
What's the point?
I would love to read a peer-reviewed study on that. I mean, if we need a boreal forest.
Economist magazine, they talk about it all the time.
All right, I will check that out. But I mean, is the suggestion that we need a boreal forest fire department?
I'm asking you. I mean, well, what y'all's position is? I get it. Nobody's perfect. Oil and gas is bad, and they're destroying the world. Let's get rid of them.
Yeah.
Okay. If we do that, that's going to cost a lot? If we do that, is the world going to be okay? No.
I got you. I see where you're going. But let's, if I might, Mr. Chairman, if I could just take your beautiful state, which is very close to my heart. I lived in New Orleans a couple of times.
Come back and spend money.
But I definitely will. I plan to do that. Louisiana has traditionally dealt with hurricanes, but is now experiencing hurricanes of much greater velocity and much greater ferocity under the climate change conditions.
Really?
Well, then perhaps the science that I've been seeing is...
The damages are higher because Louisiana's wealthier and there's more to destroy. But if you look at the studies on the intensity, they're about the same.
All right, but
Kennedy, Senator Kane is waiting to proceed. If you don't,
we were just having a good talk.
No, and I'm enjoying this. Actually, I'm not complaining.
I'm sorry, Timmy. I'm sorry. Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, Senator.
Just for the record, my research while Senator Kennedy was speaking is that the total wildfire emissions are 1.8 billion tons of CO2 compared to 38 billion tons from fossil and industry. So we may have a dispute over the facts here. But with that, let me turn it over to Senator Kaine.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and to my committee members. I actually was really enjoying that. And Rep. Raskin, so good to have you here before us. This hearing reminds me of one that I had in the Foreign Relations Committee in early 2017, where we were conspected their obfuscation around climate science. And at one point I said, now, are you telling me you can't answer them or you won't answer them? And he was very honest. He said, yeah, I'm telling you both. And really, it was more that he wouldn't answer them. And I can see why. The committee's investigative work has laid out a pretty important record, I think, of efforts by these companies to mislead the public. But what I want to focus my questions on is the efforts by the oil companies to mislead Congress or just not cooperate with Congress. And I understand in the House investigation, I'd like you to talk about this a little bit, Representative Raskin, that there was many, many instances of refusal to cooperate with the investigation by ExxonMobil and others. Could you just describe that a bit?
Well, when we first sent out the requests, as I was describing before, we got a mountain of minutia and distracting material, newsletters and press releases and so on. We then used our subpoena power to get more serious, and we got more serious answers, but still we had thousands of documents that were redacted in substantial and perhaps critical ways. That would be my suspicion. And there were entire documents that we never received at all. And this is why, I close my remarks by invoking Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, which is all about how if you have a small group in society that's invested in a particular model that's dangerous to everyone and they're allowed to get away with it, that becomes a telltale sign of a potential collapse of the society. And so when the United States Congress comes calling, you owe it to the Congress, the representatives of the people, to give the information. The Supreme Court has repeatedly found, you guys know these cases, I'm sure, McGain versus Daugherty is one of them, but the Supreme Court has been adamant that we have the right to get the information that we want in order to legislate. We're the representatives of the people.
I want to ask about one particular reason asserted by at least one of the companies, and maybe more, for not producing documents that I found kind of Alice in Wonderland-like. We are not going to give you these documents because sharing information would violate our First Amendment rights. Now, you are a constitutional law professor, and by my recollection, the First Amendment with respect to speech says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech.
Yeah.
It is a right, whether or not the First Amendment should have been applied to corporations, we'll set that one aside. Yeah. It has been applied, and so corporations have a right to speak. But the notion that a corporation would claim their First Amendment gives them a right not to share information, to hide information that they're embarrassed by, even in the face of a congressional subpoena, strikes me as like, that's the opposite of the First Amendment.
I think you're right. I mean, giving them their due, the Supreme Court has found in cases like West Virginia versus Barnett that there is a right not to speak against conscience. But the Supreme Court has always found that turning over documents is an objective act that doesn't compel you to do something against your own political ideas. So that would obviously lead to the end of our civil and criminal discovery system if the First Amendment gave you the right not to turn over documents.
Well, I was a trial lawyer for a while. I'm not one of John Kennedy's acumen or flamboyance, but I was a pretty good one.
I deny everything.
But I will say you can always tell when an objection is made if it is an extremely unpersuasive, novel, imaginative, unsupported objection. You can always tell there's something they really don't want you to see.
Yeah.
And I think that the investigation contains an awful lot of material that the public needs to see, but I can only imagine the extent of the iceberg under the water that you are not allowed to see. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Kane. Next is Senator Johnson, who will be followed by Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congressman, welcome.
Senator.
Are you aware of the World Climate Declaration? There is no climate emergency. It's signed by now over 1,800 global scientists, professionals.
There is no climate emergency? It was.
Are you aware of that declaration?
I'm not aware of that one. I assume I'm aware, familiar.
I entered in the record. I'd recommend you read it. I thought one of the...
Without objection, it will be entered into the record.
Well, I already did it, but we'll enter into this one too. I thought one of the interesting statements in there is the obvious, that CO2 is plant food. If you want a green planet, you need some CO2. But anyway, you ought to take a look at that. You know, by the way, I'm not a climate change denier. I'm just not a climate change alarmist like you and the chairman. I would call myself a climate change realist. In your testimony, you say, my watery home state of Maryland with more than 7,100 miles of coastline is strikingly vulnerable to the effects of climate change and the rising sea level. So that's one of the biggest alarms of the climate change, folks, is that the sea level will rise and just wipe out coastlines, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So are you aware of how much the sea level has risen in the Bay of San Francisco since the last glaciation period of, some 12 to 20,000 years ago, which is just a blink of the eye in geologic time. Do you know how much the sea level has risen in the Bay of San Francisco in that time period?
I do not know that one.
You want to just take a guess?
No, because I'm not guessing very well today, so no.
It's 390 feet. Do you think there's anything mankind could have done to prevent that level sea level rise of 390 feet, just again, 20,000 years?
Well,
you think there's something we could do about that?
no.
Okay, good. That's the answer. No, there's nothing we could do about that. And by the way, the chairman mentioned witnesses brought before this committee have. Let me tell you what some of them have said. Majority witnesses. When I asked a majority witness, about 80% of world power in the U.S. globally is created by fossil fuel. I asked, do you believe that either India or China are going to give up their coal-burning plants? And the majority witness said no, and neither are we, because we simply can't. So I'm kind of getting back to Senator Kennedy's point, is there's nothing we can do about this other than adapt. Another witness claimed that we've spent about $5 trillion. And this is before the Inflation Reduction Act, which, by the way, isn't $400 billion with a tax credit. Goldman Sachs was about $1.2 trillion. So that's about $6 trillion we've already spent combating climate change. The question I have for you, has all that spending done anything to impact climate change? $5 to $6 trillion already spent?
But undoubtedly it has.
Where's the proof?
Well,
I mean, you're here before the committee again. We've had 16, 17 hearings now. Again, climate change alarmism. We're going to destroy our planet. It's not going to keep lasting. Got to do something now. We've been doing $6 trillion worth. I haven't heard any reduction in the alarmism here whatsoever.
Well, you describe yourself, I think, as a climate realist. But it sounds to me more like you're a climate fatalist, that there's really nothing that can be done. The focus of the hearing today, of course, is on the big oil industry's attempts to obscure the problem for many decades and then to undermine any potential solutions.
Are you aware of the Vostok ice core samples?
I'm sorry?
The Vostok ice core samples. Okay, this is the most famous analysis over 440,000 years. Shows five very distinct cycles. Do you know what the temperature variation of those cycles was?
The seasonally, you mean, or you mean over time?
No, over geologic time, 440,000 years.
Oh, well, there's been ice ages, and I'm sure it's dramatic.
Again, do you know what the temperature variation revealed in those things is?
Please share.
22.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And oh, by the way, and they didn't really talk about this, but CO2 ended up being a lagging indicator to temperature, which would imply that as the globe warms, all the CO2, most of it's locked up in the ocean, gets unlocked, and so it's temperature that causes CO2 to rise as opposed to the exact opposite. Again, it's one of the orbital forcing. There's all kinds of other theories about this. What I'm saying is it's not settled science. So why are we projecting spending trillions of dollars to impact something that we really, in the end, can't change? That's my point.
Yeah, but I think the claim that the science is uncertain is itself a lagging indicator. I mean, we heard that for decades from big oil, that we just couldn't know that there's a study on this side, there's a study on that side. I think the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence.
Yeah, no, I realize that.
The overwhelming weight of scientific evidence is on the conclusion that man-made causes are behind climate change.
Check out these 800 scientists led by two Nobel Prize winners in physics. Check out their World Climate Declaration. There is no climate emergency.
But I will definitely check that out, and I'll get back to you on it. I mean, again, and this is difficult for those of us who are not scientists, because all that we can do, or at least all we can reasonably do, is depend on the scientific authorities that are part of our government and that are part of the United Nations and that are rendering the conclusions that we can count on. But I'm very happy to read any kind of dissenting views. I really am.
Next is Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congressman Raskin, great to see you, and thanks for all your work in the area that's the subject of the hearing today and for all you do for the great state of Maryland. Just to follow up on that question, isn't it the case that your investigation revealed that the big oil companies themselves knew that producing the massive amount of greenhouse gas emissions that they did would contribute to global climate change?
Yes, they engaged in the science themselves. They were in the very first wave of scientists who were looking at it. They used objective scientific measures and analysis, and they came to the conclusion that the combustion of fossil fuels leads to climate destabilization and global warming. And only later did they come to the kind of rhetoric suggesting that all science is equal, and we can throw a dart on the wall and figure out just as well what's happening. That was not their initial take on this problem.
Right. I mean, I think the point is that we continue to hear voices who deny the science that the oil companies themselves looked at back in the day before they turned to a deliberate strategy of denial. Right.
And they continue to use it for their own internal business planning purposes. I mean, you can be certain that they're not fooling around with fake science when it comes to their own business projections and their own plans for the future.
Right. So, look, there's some who argue that the house is on fire, but we shouldn't do anything about it because it's going to keep burning and just eventually burn to the ground. I think most of us recognize that what makes sense for all of us and for humanity is to try to put out the fire before it consumes the entire planet, destroys our economies, and does other damage. So I wanted to ask you about the whole notion of what economists call externalities, because I put forward a proposal. It's right now a white paper called the Polluter Pays Climate Fund legislation. I'm pleased that both the Sheldon Whitehouse, the Senator Whitehouse, Senator Merkley, and others are part of this effort, which we will eventually convert to legislation. And, Mr. Chairman, I would like to put the white paper on the Polluter Pays Climate Fund Act into the record.
Without objection.
So there's going to be a lot of litigation. There already is, both in local jurisdictions, Baltimore City, state of Maryland, using the model of tobacco companies. And I think that those cases should be pursued. But there's also another approach here that's not to the exclusion of those efforts, which is to apply the Superfund model. And essentially the Superfund model was, if you broke it, you pay for it, right? Why should the public be having to pay all the costs of harm that is due to the actions of big oil companies and other major emitters? And the idea behind the Superfund is pretty much the science is clear. In this case, the damage done by greenhouse gas emissions is clear. So there should be a strict liability standard, effectively, a polluter pays standard. You mentioned, for example, the cost just in the city of Annapolis, $4 billion to help, raise the dock, $27 billion over time. That's just one small example. So this proposal would look at the very largest emitters. So we're talking about 25 to 30 of the emitters here in the United States, or anybody who's doing business here in the United States. Could you talk to the importance of pursuing a polluter pays approach?
Well, thank you, Senator Van Hollen. I have not familiarized myself with the details of your proposal, and I would love to check it out. But it certainly sounds like it addresses the major problem, which is what the economists call the tragedy of the commons. I mean, who owns the sky? Who owns the climate? Nobody does. But who uses the climate? Who uses the sky as part of their business model? Big Carbon does. And of course, all of us are implicated in it to the extent that we drive cars and use fossil fuels, which we do. But they're the ones who have profited from it and been deeply invested on a long-term basis in it. And yet, they are not asked to pay for either the short-term, the medium-term, or the long-term effects of climate destabilization. So when you say polluter pays, I take it what you're getting at is that the companies that are profiting handsomely from this business model have to pay for the costs associated with it, which is just a basic principle of good public policy. You want the industries that are causing particular social problems to be forced to be held financially accountable for them.
Well, that's exactly right. And as you know, these companies, the biggest companies, have profited greatly off of this. And the concept behind here actually is those who polluted the most should pay the most for cleaning up the damage and harm they've done. And I'm pleased to have worked with an organization I know you're familiar with, the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, in developing this proposal. Look forward to working with you. And we've got some other House members engaged as well. So thank you for all the work that you've done to bring us to this point. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.